Hi everyone, and welcome back to Philosophy of the Paranormal with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. So today we're going to be talking about ESP and PK, that is extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. We talked a little bit about these phenomena or purported phenomena last time. Today we're going to dive into these topics in a little bit more detail, and we'll do so by looking primarily at chapter 21 from Blackmore's book, Consciousness: An Introduction, and a little bit of chapter 9. I've of course made these readings available on Brightspace, and as I mentioned previously, I don't care whether you read them before or after the lecture. Do whatever works for you. But this is what we'll be talking about today. Before that, just a little bit of quick housekeeping. I meant to have this lecture uploaded for Monday. Of course, most of you will be watching this on Tuesday. That's because I had my COVID shot over the weekend. I had my second dose on Saturday. And Sunday and Monday, well, today's Monday. I feel better today, but Sunday I was not feeling too good, so I did not get the lecture done. But that's okay. Many of you have asked me why I'm uploading the lectures on Mondays and Wednesdays, or trying to at any rate, when the class is technically scheduled for Tuesdays and Thursdays. The reason I'm doing that is just so that I can stay ahead. This is actually an asynchronous class, so don't feel like you have to watch the videos as soon as they go up, or that you have to watch them at the time that it says on the class schedule. Tuesdays and Thursdays from 6 to 9 or whatever it says. You can watch them at your convenience, but do try to get both lectures for any given week done on that week so you don't fall behind. But if I upload a video Monday and you can't watch it till Tuesday, that's fine, okay? I'm only trying to upload for Mondays and Wednesdays so that when stuff like this happens, when you get your COVID shot and you get some side effects and you feel a little under the weather for a day or two, that way the work still gets done for when it needs to be done. So that's why I'm doing it that way, just in case any of you are curious. So that's housekeeping out of the way. Now we can talk about ESP and PK, and we can do that by looking at Susan Blackmore's 2010 book, Consciousness: An Introduction, which has some excellent content that concerns the paranormal, because Susan Blackmore used to be a parapsychologist. All right, let's get rocking. All right, so why should we study paranormal phenomena like ESP and PK, first of all? Well, if you're one of my students who believes in these phenomena, believes in the existence of ESP and PK, then you probably think that we should try to understand them. And I would agree with that. I mean, I do not believe that these phenomena are real, but if they were, I think we ought to study them, and I think it would be possible to study them. It would be a bit like I mentioned in my last lecture when I made the analogy between paranormal phenomena and things like the Force in the Star Wars universe, right? It might seem like magic to the uninitiated, but really it's all energy fields and midichlorians and whatever. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about, just go and watch all of the Star Wars trilogies. If you're one of the skeptically minded students, you might be thinking, well, I don't believe these things exist. Why should we study them? And the reason, according to Blackmore, has to do with what the believers in this class can probably relate to, and that is that belief in the paranormal and reported experiences of the paranormal, claims that people make that they have maybe received a telepathic message or that they're clairvoyant or something. These claims occur a lot. The number of these claims are high, and belief in the paranormal is high. And Blackmore gives us some interesting statistics in this regard here that we'll take a look at briefly. So, for example, in a 1991 Gallup poll, which had a sample size of over 1,000, it was revealed that 1/4 of the participants claimed to have communicated with somebody using ESP, that is telepathy. Further, half the participants in this particular study believed in ESP, and this is from the Gallup and Newport, quoted in Blackmore. In another study, or survey I should say, that took place in 2001, a repeat of that same poll, that the Gallup poll from 1991, so we reran that poll, showed very similar results. So 41% of the respondents for the 2001 poll said that they believed in ESP, and 31% of the respondents said they believed in telepathy, which is a type of ESP. 26% said they believe in clairvoyance, which is another type of ESP, as we'll see today. And I should mention that this survey contained many different items. It didn't just include paranormal phenomena in the strict sense, the sense we've talked about so far that grew out of psychical research and eventually kind of became the subject matter of parapsychology. So we're not just talking about ESP and PK items on this survey. It also included items like channeling, belief in astrology, which we'll talk about later in the course, belief in ghosts, which is actually the topic of our next lecture. Well, kind of ghosts, but really talking to the dead, mediumship, which I guess is kind of related to channeling in a way. So almost 3/4 of Americans, this survey reveals, believed in at least one of these paranormal phenomena. And the paranormal phenomena in this survey go beyond just the parapsychological, of course. Now, in a British survey that was reported, I don't know where it was initially reported, but Blackmore discussed it in a number of, she discusses it in a number of her works, including this one. This survey had 600,000, or 600,000, no. This survey had 6,000 respondents, and 59% of those respondents reported that they believe in ESP. So as we can see, belief in the paranormal is high, not just for the paranormal phenomena that were studied by parapsychologists like ESP and PK, but also other things like astrology, ghosts, channeling, and so forth. So that's one reason why we should study the paranormal phenomena like ESP and PK. A lot of people believe in them. And this is kind of where anomalistic psychology comes into play. Rather than trying to explain paranormal phenomena, trying to explain psi phenomena by appealing to new laws of nature or possible future directions of human evolution or the supernatural, what anomalistic psychology does is try to explain why people might perhaps believe they have communicated to somebody else via telepathy or something like that. Anyway, belief in the paranormal is high, so that's one reason to study not only the paranormal, but paranormal beliefs. Another reason has to do with what I mentioned earlier, that if the paranormal were real, it would be worth studying, and I think that we could study it. I think that if these phenomena were real, they would turn out to have naturalistic explanations. And the fact that we have not yet identified any naturalistic mechanisms to explain things like ESP and PK, combined with the fact that there is actually a lot of not only fraud, people tend to emphasize fraudulent mediums and so forth, but also just false belief, innocent false belief in the way certain aspects of the world work, right? What was I talking about again? I think I need more coffee. Right, I mean, the fact that we haven't been able to explain things like this naturalistically, and that there isn't really all that much evidence once you discount fraud and false belief and things like that, the stuff that anomalistic psychologists might be interested in, there really isn't that much there. But if there were, I would suspect that things like ESP and psi, were they real phenomena, they would have a naturalistic explanation. Just like in the Star Wars universe, the Force has a naturalistic explanation. It's not magic. It's, an energy field, it's midichlorians, it's all that sci-fi jargon, right? But the second reason to study the paranormal that Blackmore emphasizes is that if these phenomena were real, if, say, ESP or PK were real, that would have absolutely massive implications for the sciences. It would be like a bomb going off. It would be a paradigm shift like no other, beyond Newton and Newtonian physics and gravitation, beyond Darwin's theory of evolution, beyond Einstein's theory of general and special relativity. It would be a paradigm shift like no other. Just think about it. Blackmore has us think about it a little bit here, where she says that if telepathy were real, for example, if it were possible to communicate with another mind via extrasensory motor means, then we couldn't rely on things like double-blind experiments, or indeed any experiments where we have to keep information sort of insulated, where we have to have naive participants who perhaps don't know the true purpose of the experiment that they're coming to participate in, right? Or double-blind experiments. This is where neither the participant nor the person administering the experiment, say for example, knows which experimental condition that's happening at that moment, right? And that's to try and avoid things like experimenter bias or leakage, like maybe the experimenter gives some kind of unconscious clue depending on what condition he or she is running. Well, if the experimenter is naive about which condition is being run, then no problem. But if telepathy were real, maybe there'd be some leakage anyway between the experimenter and the participant's brains. Who knows, right? So this kind of telepathic interference, if it were real, would absolutely ruin the results of psychology experiments that rely on naive participants or on double-blind experiments. If psychokinesis were real, Blackmore says, then that would have huge effects or a huge impact on physics. For example, if we can affect the physical universe with our mind, in an extrasensory motor kind of way, then the results of certain physics experiments in, say, quantum mechanics would be invalidated. We would have to discard them. You've probably heard of the observer effect in quantum mechanics, Quantum mechanics is a very funny area of physics, and there are many, many different interpretations of what goes on in that subatomic realm. And of course, I am no physicist, so it would be inappropriate for me to try to explain this to you. But basically, the observer effect has to do with something called the measurement problem, which we'll talk about later in this lecture. And it means that when we observe something on the quantum level, things change, We collapse the wave function, as it were, or we branch off into another universe or something, right? There's many, many different interpretations of quantum mechanics, but if we could affect, say the subatomic realm in an extrasensory motor way with psychokinesis, that means we'd have to throw out a lot of the experimental data that we've gathered over the past century when it comes to quantum mechanics. So that would be bad. Of course, if precognition were real, knowledge of the future, we'd have to reevaluate many of our fundamental assumptions about space and time and the mind. If this stuff is real, then that would have some very big implications. So Blackmore thinks that it's worth looking into this stuff for those two reasons. Belief rates are high, and if it turned out to be the case that these phenomena are real, it really would have massive scientific implications. And I think that scientists would really be interested in that. I mean, imagine if you as a scientist proved either ESP or PK were real, you'd probably get some kind of Nobel Prize. The point is, it would be a paradigm shift like no other if we established that these phenomena were real. So it is worth studying them, Blackmore says, and I agree with her. So let's continue. Now, before we dive further in, I want to get a little metaphysical with you. Now, remember last time when we talked about metaphysical naturalism and methodological naturalism? Well, we got to talk a little bit more about metaphysics here. So recall the idea of metaphysical naturalism. The idea that reality is just the natural world. Like what exists is just nature, the cosmos, matter and energy and all their properties, right? If ESP did exist, it would be explainable via natural laws, right? So metaphysical naturalism implies this. And it also tends to imply a particular kind of naturalistic worldview. which is sometimes called materialism and sometimes called physicalism, but same basic metaphysics, really. Materialism or physicalism is a kind of substance monism. So when philosophers talk about metaphysics and they talk about substance, when we talk about substance, we're talking about stuff. Stuff that exists. What exists? Well, according to materialism or physicalism, one kind of stuff exists, and that is physical stuff. Again, matter, energy, all their associated properties and so forth. Those are the things that exist. There are no gods, there are no spirits or souls, or if there were, they wouldn't be supernatural. There would be some kind of naturalistic explanation for them, right? Of course, this implies that the mind is contingent upon physical matter, right? This means that if we ask about the brain and compare that with the notion of the mind, or perhaps even the soul, then the mind, or if you want to call it the soul, is just what the brain does as a physical system. So, and there are many different ways of slicing this up, right? You have identity theory. This is not in the slides, but I figure I'd mention it. Identity theory just says that mental states are brain states, right? And you have functionalism, which says that mental states are functional states, and the brain is a functional system. So the mind is realized within the brain, right? We can say that. But in both cases, the mind is contingent upon the brain. Although if you're a functionalist, you probably think you could create a mind by implementing it in some other physical means, like a computer or a robot, right? Why do I mention substance monism? Or why do I mention souls and whatnot? Well, if you want to dive deep into this stuff, you can check out some of the lectures from my previous class, Minds and Machines, which is really all about the mind and the soul and the human being, and the view that we are like natural machines, that we are like part of a clockwork universe. And you can check that out because I talk about René Descartes quite extensively in that class, and he's important here because the substance monism that I've been talking about, physicalism or materialism, can be contrasted with the view of somebody like Descartes, which of course is substance dualism. What is substance dualism? Well, if you're familiar with the work of René Descartes, the rationalist father of modern philosophy, right? René Descartes believed that there existed two different substances. There was extended substance, or res extensa, that's physical stuff like matter, and then there's mind, or res cogitans, thinking substance, the soul, essentially. So, we have res extensa, which takes up space, interacts with other matter, and this is the stuff that a physicalist or a materialist would agree exists. Mind for Descartes is non-physical, it doesn't take up space, it's basically the soul. A physicalist would deny that mind is a substance in this way, right? Instead, she might say that the mind is reducible to, physical processes in the brain or functional relations between brain states or something like that. So Descartes equated this res extensa, or extended substance, with our bodies, and res cogitans, or thinking substance, with our minds, or our rational souls. And this view is actually quite old. It goes all the way back to Plato, who I also talk about in this class. I've put some cards up here in case any of you want to check those lectures out. But don't feel obligated to. Just think of them as kind of like extra bonus material that can help shore up your understanding if you're not familiar with these aspects of the philosophical tradition. On substance dualism, especially Descartes' substance dualism, the soul was created by God, it was immortal, and it could survive death, right? So that's substance dualism. And we can compare that, or rather contrast it, with substance monism, and the most common kinds of substance monism that we tend to see are like, physicalism or materialism, okay? So keep those ideas in mind. All right, so why do we want to keep these ideas in mind? Well, according to Blackmore, evidence for the paranormal, but especially the psychical or parapsychological, is often sought by people who, for noble reasons or sometimes ignoble reasons, want to undermine materialist theories of the mental. I think this is especially true of the spiritualist movement and the psychical research that was going on in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I think it's especially true of that. It's arguably not as true when it comes to parapsychology, because as we saw last time, J.B. Rhine and Louisa Rhine, that is Joseph Banks Rhine and his wife Louisa, they, not only when they studied the paranormal did they not look at special cases, for lack of a better term. You know, they didn't look at people who claimed to have special powers. They didn't look at mediums. They looked at regular people instead. And also, they kind of avoided anything that had to do with the questions concerning the existence of souls or life after death, right? So it's not as true of parapsychology, but it's certainly true of psychical research, which was kind of the predecessor to parapsychology. And you know, this kind of thing also makes a resurgence every few years in the popular culture as well. You know, there are shows like Ghost Hunters, right? Where, and I'm not lying about this, a group of plumbers would hunt ghosts. And yeah, that's the show. There's also things like Long Island Medium. I remember probably more than a decade ago now, you had like John Edwards and Sylvia Brown and James Van Praagh and these kinds of fellows. Before that, you had Uri Geller, right? So this kind of pops up again and again in the pop culture. But in popular spheres, you sometimes hear this all talked about in terms of, you know, like the power of consciousness or the law of attraction or mind over matter or one of these kinds of platitudes, right? Like, for example, in the 2004 film The Secret, which is a pretty bad film, if I do say so myself, you know, it's all about the law of attraction, which is the idea of like attracts like. It's the idea that, you know, you can manifest things that are good for you in the universe. You put good vibes in the universe or something, and good stuff comes back to you. And you know, the law of attraction. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it because it's pretty pseudoscientific. But there's also What the Bleep Do We Know, a 2004 film, which is also a pretty questionable documentary. It claims that people can influence events in their lives using the power of conscious intention. So films like The Secret and What the Bleep Do We Know talk about this kind of law of attraction sort of thing, or the power of consciousness. And this is not, you know, like psychokinesis in the strict sense, but it's the same kind of thing. It's like, oh, your thoughts can affect the physical universe, right? So another popular book that Blackmore mentions is The Conscious Universe, The Scientific Truth of Psychic Phenomena, which was authored by Dean Radin in 1997. Radin is a parapsychologist from America, and he's the director of the Consciousness Research Laboratory, and he argues that understanding such experiences, like ESP, require an expanded view of human consciousness. Does this expanded view equal a non-materialist view? I mean, yeah, that's kind of what these folks are arguing. That's why we should not only take claims of the paranormal seriously, but we should seriously scrutinize them as well. And this isn't about being a party pooper, right? I mean, science works, and science is pretty naturalistic. And, you know, we all trust that our smartphones and our computers are going to work, our cars are going to get us where we need to go. We go to the doctor, we can trust that he or she is going to, you know, give us medicine that works. Like, science works. And it's based on this naturalistic kind of outlook. We can't just throw all of that out willy-nilly, right? We can't just pretend like that's not true to allow for an expanded view of consciousness, or a non-materialist view of consciousness. That is, we can't do that without evidence, and there is not good evidence for any of this at the moment, as we're going to discuss today. So, why do we take these claims seriously and seriously scrutinize them? Well, according to Blackmore, if paranormal claims are false, then we need to explain why belief in the paranormal is so widespread. And we need to explain when people have experiences of the paranormal, we need to be able to explain them naturalistically. And that's kind of where anomalistic psychology enters the picture. Then again, on the flip side, if paranormal claims are true, then philosophers and scientists need to work out the implications that this would have for metaphysics or consciousness studies, the cognitive sciences like psychology, or like all of the experimental sciences, really. Because if ESP and PK were real, then, as we saw earlier, this would have massive implications from everything from psychology to quantum physics, you know. We'd really have to ask, as the bad documentary is entitled, what the bleep do we know, right? Alright, so at this point in the chapter, chapter 21 that is, Blackmore turns to survey the history of spiritualism in the USA and Europe. Now, we've discussed this previously, so I don't know how much detail we're going to go into, but what have we already learned? Well, we learned that the spiritualist movement started in the United States, actually thanks to the Fox sisters, and we're going to talk about the Fox sisters in our lecture on ghosts, or talking to the dead. But basically, it started in the USA and moved to Europe, and some scientists in say Great Britain and mainland Europe started to take an interest in these paranormal claims, like William Crookes, one of the members of the Society for Psychical Research that we learned about earlier. So he tried to explain paranormal activity in terms of non-materialist explanations as opposed to materialist or physicalist explanations. So there were scientists. Crookes himself, I believe, lost his son. I'm kind of sketchy on the details here, but I believe this is talked about in Blackmore's chapter. But I believe he lost his son and became an ardent spiritualist after this. I think it was the loss of his son that kind of spurred his belief in life after death and in spiritualism and whatnot. So a lot of scientists were taking paranormal claims seriously, and not only that, they were seeking non-materialist explanations. Even into the 20th century, none other than Alan Turing, the forefather of computer science and artificial intelligence, in his paper Computing Machinery and Intelligence, talks about how the evidence for ESP is overwhelming and how we should like to discredit these studies and whatnot, but that the evidence was overwhelming. Of course, the evidence, it's the kind of evidence we talked about before, Zener cards, 7.1 hit rate versus a hit rate of 5, with improved statistics we can see that, there's not really anything going on there. But at the time, these results were quite impressive. Nonetheless, others in the 19th century, going back in time a bit, did treat these claims skeptically, and even uncovered cases of fraud. So, for example, Michael Faraday, did this, and we'll see that in our next lecture as well. Now, Blackmore also discusses the origins of parapsychology, which we've also talked about. We've discussed, for example, how J.B. Rhine and his wife Louisa began the first parapsychology lab at Duke University, and that they didn't study unique individuals, right? They didn't study people who claimed to have special powers. They just examined ordinary people. And they tested for telepathy. They were interested in all kinds of ESP, but especially telepathy using Zener cards, which we talked about previously. And they tested for PK by examining whether people could affect the outcomes of dice rolls using their thoughts, or extrasensory motor means. Now remember, the term psi, was coined by the Rhines, and it refers to ESP and PK. Now, how do we break this down? Well, ESP, of course, stands for extrasensory perception, and we have three kinds of extrasensory perception that we usually group under this umbrella. We've got telepathy, which is the transmissions of thoughts from one mind to another outside of the known sensory channels. We have clairvoyance, which is gathering information about a place, a person, or an event through extrasensory perception. And we have precognition, which is awareness of events before they occur, or seeing the future. And then under PK, well, PK is simply defined as the extramotor ability to influence objects in your environment, in the external world. So moving objects or influencing matter, energy with the mind via some kind of extrasensory motor capacity. And this actually replaces the earlier term telekinesis. We used to call psychokinesis telekinesis. The Rhines changed the terminology, and eventually that terminology was adopted into the nomenclature of parapsychology, thanks to the Rhines. Now, we've learned a little bit about the early efforts of the Rhines and other paranormal researchers who used Zener cards, for example, right? And if you had the chance to see the Zener card experiment that I shared in the last lecture, maybe you'll have some appreciation for this. But if you haven't seen that experiment, go back to my previous lecture, go and click the link in the description and check it out. Anyway, the Rhines used Zener cards, which it's a deck of 25 cards. There are 5 different cards, and they each have an abstract pattern on them. So 5 stars, 5 crosses, 5 with 3 wavy lines, 5 with, you know, like a circle, and 5 with a square, or something like that. And they're all different colors too. So all the circles are red maybe, or something like that, right? So these experiments are a bit boring. The stimuli are very abstract. They're not very meaningful or impactful. So modern parapsychology has tried to change it up by using more meaningful or more interesting examples. And that's because, you know, like stuff like real life accounts of ESP or precognitive dreams, or you know, these real anecdotal accounts are more interesting than the kinds of things that you know, the Rhines would have their participants try and do. So as parapsychology developed, people changed up the way they would do these experiments. So for example, at the Maimonides Medical Center in New York, which is reported by Ullman and colleagues in 1973, quoted in Blackmore, there was an ESP dream research program there. And these experiments used free response methods. Zener cards are like forced choice because there's only so many options, right? But with free response, you have more possibilities, I guess, as an experimenter when it comes to your stimuli for these experiments. So anyway, what the participants would have to do is sleep in a bed in the sleep lab, and they would be woken up during REM sleep and asked to freely report the dream that they were having. We dream in the phase of sleep known as REM sleep, and we go through REM sleep several times a night. REM periods get longer as the night goes, so we can have somebody hooked up to, say, like an EEG and see when they're in REM sleep, and then we can wake them up and ask them to report their dreams. Now, while the participants were asleep, an agent would be looking at a target which was chosen at random. And there were some interesting correspondences that the experimenters observed between the target that was viewed by the agent and the dreams reported by the participants, right? So the agent is looking at this target, maybe it's you know, a guitar, and you know, maybe a guitar appears in the participant's dream because the agent is sending this guitar telepathically or something, right? Now, usually a small set of targets are used, between 4 and 6 typically, so the experimenters can work out the probability of a correspondence occurring by chance. That's why we keep these sets small. And the dream imagery is compared against the targets. Sometimes the participant does this, and sometimes an independent judge would do this. Now, the results for these early dream studies were above chance. So that generated some excitement, naturally. But as with previous parapsychological research, replicating these experimental results proved difficult. And so these dream studies kind of eventually fell out of favor. You know, you could see why maybe we want to start there. You know, dreams are kind of weird. Maybe if we do have some kind of psi abilities, they emerge in a dream state. Who knows? I mean, intuitively, it sounds kind of maybe plausible. I mean, I don't know. Dreams are weird. Our brains are active when we're sleeping. Maybe they're doing something that's conducive to ESP. Who knows? We have to find out by doing these experiments. But unfortunately, these results, these particular results, have been difficult to replicate. So it doesn't seem like there's anything there. So dream studies fell out of favor, but we adopted the methodology in order to study something else called remote viewing. So remote viewing is like this. We give a target person a location to go to. They go to this remote location and they look around for a predetermined length of time. Then there's the subject. Now they're sitting elsewhere. They're relaxing and reporting the impressions or mental images that they experience. The idea here is that the target person is perhaps the source of the telepathic transmissions or something, as it were, that the subject is observing. Later, the subject or an independent judge has to match up these impressions with a list of possible target locations where the target person went to see if she can pick the right one. This method was actually popularized by the physicists Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff. See, physicists. I told you some physicists also believe in supernatural stuff, didn't I? They were working at the Stanford Research Institute, and their experiments actually revealed highly significant results. But other psychologists, like David Marks and Richard Kahneman, have pointed out that there are problems in the methodology they used, and that could have led to these results seeming more significant than they actually were. This is something that you might have heard of. This is like maybe an instance of p-hacking. P-hacking is basically in statistics you have your p-value. You set your p-value at 0.05 or 0.01 or 0.001, and it's kind of like your statistical cutoff for statistical significance. But there are many things you can do just in terms of methodology and the way you present and analyze your data to get a significant result. Sometimes these problems are methodological. Maybe that's what was happening here. Who knows? So that research was taking place, 60s, predominantly in the 70s and into the 80s. But more recently, Blackmore tells us, in 1995, the American Institutes for Research reported on something called Stargate. What was Stargate? Well, we're not talking about the TV show. We're not talking about the Kurt Russell movie, neither of which I have seen, tragically. I should do that, actually. This Stargate that we're talking about today was actually a 24-year-long, $22 million government-funded research project, American government-funded research project, that was directed at exploring the use of remote viewing for intelligence gathering. You've heard of the term espionage, spying. Think ESP-ionage. Get it? Now, some psychologists found the results of Stargate convincing, while others did not. So Ray Hyman, who we talked about before, who is a psychologist and skeptic and former mentalist, questioned the methods that were used throughout the Stargate research program, as well as the significance of the results that were obtained. Others, like statistician Jessica Utz, disagreed with Hyman. She claimed that Stargate provided some of the best evidence for psi phenomena to date. Marks, on the other hand, in a 2000 publication, concludes that Stargate represents, quote, a series of closed-off, flawed, non-validated, and non-replicated studies. Oof, harsh. To continue, remote viewing is nothing more than a self-fulfilling subjective delusion. Yeesh, harsh. That's harsh, man. So, you've got thinkers like Utz who think that the results are significant, and then you've got thinkers like Hyman and Marx who think that the results are not significant, or rather, if they had included just a few more studies. I think in this point in the chapter, Blackmore actually points out that if just a few more studies, like we're talking less than 5, a few more studies had been included in this, or if we did a meta-analysis and just included a few more studies with non-significant results, the whole overall significance that we find in such an analysis or in the Stargate program would drop below significance. So, yeah. But whatever you believe about this, the American government did eventually conclude that ESP could not be used for espionage, and no other country that we know of has successfully employed ESP as a means of spycraft either. Of course, Project Stargate, as I mentioned, was an American thing, but the Soviets were doing this as well during the Cold War, and I doubt they had any more luck than the Americans did. Now, Russell Targ, the physicist I mentioned earlier, would continue this research despite the doubts raised about remote viewing that we've just reviewed. And again, the doubts, as we've seen in previous lectures, usually have to do with whether the results are really statistically significant, and they have to do with replicability, right? So these are the two problems that a lot of these studies face. In any case, Targ would continue his research. He would use his findings to argue that most people actually possess untapped psychic powers. So he actually sounds a bit like a psychical researcher here, rather than a physicist. This is what the psychical researchers of the 19th century and early 20th century were all about. The thinkers in the Society for Psychical Research, for example, would often frame things as, like, okay, there are these paranormal phenomena, but they're not weird, they're not supernatural, we can explain them, we just don't have the right scientific tools or the right scientific vocabulary, we don't know the right laws of nature, maybe there's some undiscovered laws of nature that govern this stuff, maybe this is the beginning of a new step in human evolution. Targ sounds a lot like these thinkers, even though he's a physicist, and physics is very materialistic. Targ himself is somewhat of a spiritualist. So I guess it's possible to hold both views. You can embrace the natural and the supernatural like Targ does. Anyway, what Targ says, just to finish that thought, he claims that the sort of clatter or chatter of the conscious mind suppresses our psychic abilities. And if you're like a spiritually inclined person, I suppose that makes sense, right? I mean, think about why do we do things like meditate or do yoga? I don't do those things. Maybe I should. But, they say that if you meditate and quiet the conscious mind, you can understand the true nature of, the self or reality or life or something, right? Because we quiet the conscious mind. Maybe something like that will also facilitate any kind of suppressed psychic abilities to pop out, although I'm skeptical of that possibility. But anyway, Targ says, or rather, here I'll start with this. If we could quiet our conscious minds, along the lines that Targ suggests, perhaps using meditation, we could, quote, see into the far reaches of time and space through remote viewing. This is from a 2004 publication quoted in Blackmore's chapter, which we're looking at now. Now, here I've got to say, as a scientist and a philosopher, I mean, if that were possible, yeah, sign me up. I mean, come on, that would be so cool to be able to travel the universe and learn the secrets of space and time using only the mind. I would love for something like that to be real. But it doesn't seem like there's much evidence for it, and I'm sorry to say, and this is why I'm really trying to emphasize throughout this course that I'm not trying to be a skeptic just for the purpose of being a downer, right? It would be really neat. It would have some amazing implications if this stuff were real. It just doesn't seem like the evidence is good enough for it. And that's, again, mainly due to whether the evidence is actually statistically significant, and the fact that a lot of the results of these studies are simply not replicable. Hi. Hi. How are you? How are you? How are you? Boop. All right, so next, Blackmore goes on to talk about the ESP research that uses the Ganzfeld, or whole field. Ganzfeld is German for whole field, right? And it's an experimental technique that's used in some research on ESP. I'll put a little image of what someone looks like up here when they're in the Ganzfeld. Basically, in a typical Ganzfeld experiment, the participant lies down and has some headphones on. White noise is played through the headphones. And they've got these half ping pong balls over their eyes. And the room is lit with a red light. And this creates a sort of uniform, monochromatic, pinkish field of view. This is the Ganzfeld. And this is thought, for some reason, by parapsychologists to induce a psi-conducive state of consciousness. Notice the emphasis on state of consciousness there. Now, in a Ganzfeld experiment, basically the participant reports everything she experiences while she's in the Ganzfeld. So this is the person here, or here. I'm not sure where, somewhere. She's in the Ganzfeld. She's got the ping pong balls, pink field of view, white noise on the headphones, okay? And she reports everything she experiences while she's in the Ganzfeld. And this is recorded so that it can be examined later. While this is happening, the sender sits in a remote location, and he's viewing a picture or a video or, whatever stimuli, right? Now, after 30 minutes, the participant, that's the person who was in the Ganzfeld, is shown 4 pictures or videos and asked to decide which one was the target, what the sender sent. Another free choice sort of scenario. Sometimes an independent judge has to choose the target by comparing the possible targets with, say, like a transcript of what the participant said she experienced while in the Ganzfeld. And many researchers actually claim to have had successful results using this method, going so far as to even claim that it provides a reliable means of replicating psi experimental results. But, of course, as Blackmore discusses next, critics disagree. We'll talk about some of the reasons why Ganzfeld is problematic in a moment, but for now we'll go on to something called remote staring. So there's one interesting experimental technique, which is actually alleged by some parapsychologists to show that people can tell if somebody is staring at them even when the person being stared at can't see them. So if I'm, facing this way and someone's staring at the back of my head, does it feel like someone's looking at me? Do I get that weird feeling someone's spying on me, maybe? Right? So that's remote staring. And Rupert Sheldrake has developed this methodology to study remote staring using video cameras, and he even has developed online methods to try and avoid sensory leakage. But basically he claims that there is evidence for this phenomenon of remote staring, and that this evidence suggests that people possess some kind of perceptual field that, quote, extends beyond the head. Interesting, right? And he further remarks, quote, that this is more compatible with theories of vision that involve both inward and outward movements of influence. And this is from a 2005 publication of his that Blackmore quotes. So this is to say, I guess, that some kind of psychical force or field extends from the observer's eyes and is detected by the one who's being stared at. Of course, this doesn't really make sense on current theories of vision or optics or really anything. This kind of violates Occam's razor, right? We need a lot of new things about physics and physiology and optics to be true for his theory to be true. And it just doesn't look like it's very plausible, very parsimonious. So critics accuse Sheldrake of, misunderstanding theories of vision, of mistaking signal for noise in his experiments, and so on. So again, there are methodological problems that we're running into here. All right, so far, according to the survey of parapsychological research that Blackmore lays out in this chapter, it seems as though the evidence for ESP and PK and psi, well, we haven't really looked at PK too closely yet, but it seems like the evidence for ESP, at any rate, is quite lacking. Now, maybe you buy Blackmore's criticisms or not. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of what we're about to talk about next, but just ask yourself, what if one day experiments did produce reliable evidence for ESP? Experiments that weren't subject to the methodological criticisms or held up against the methodological criticisms that Blackmore surveys here. What would that mean for science? Well, a lot of people would probably claim that it illustrates the power of consciousness, right? The power of consciousness, whatever that means. But even if there were successful ESP experiments, The evidence doesn't seem to be in favor of these being abilities that we can consciously control, right? Even if, for example, you look at some of the studies that we've already looked at that were, that did find statistically significant results, and you forget about the problems associated with the methodology or with the statistical analysis and just assume that, yeah, the results really were not due to chance and there is something going on there, it still doesn't seem, according to those results, that these are abilities that people can consciously control, right? Indeed, in a lot of these experiments, participants aren't aware of when their guesses for, the target object amongst a set of objects, they're not aware of when they make a correct or an incorrect guess. So that suggests that, even if ESP exists, it doesn't seem like the kind of thing we can exercise voluntarily. Many would probably also claim that this supports some form of dualism. Probably substance dualism, maybe property dualism, I don't know, but definitely substance dualism in the Cartesian sense. But from there, it's kind of a slippery slope into, ghosts and stuff like that, which parapsychologists say they don't study. They don't look into life after death. But if your motivation is to establish that dualism is the correct way to look at the universe, then, you're kind of sneakily letting ghosts and stuff in the back door, I guess, if we could put it that way. And what's really interesting here when we talk about consciousness and the power of consciousness is that some of these methods also involve an altered state of consciousness. Ganzfeld experiments, for example, produce a mild altered state of consciousness. And this is interesting to me because altered states, like I mentioned earlier with dreams, are often induced to produce spiritual experiences, dreams or consuming, certain kinds of mushrooms or plants that have alkaloids that make you hallucinate, like peyote or ayahuasca. These are things that indigenous cultures have used to induce important spiritual experiences, right? So I think that's pretty interesting that, maybe there is something to the idea of, quieting the mind and, using altered states to do that and to maybe awaken the power of consciousness. It seems intuitively like a road that we should explore and that indeed has been explored. But the problem is, it's never really been shown that people in altered states do better in the kinds of experiments we've looked at today. And really that makes sense. What is it about a Ganzfeld that is supposed to make you, be more conducive to ESP? What is it about it? Parapsychologists don't know. Why have ping pong balls and a red light so that you have this uniform pink field of vision and white noise? I guess to quiet the mind by, kind of flattening the sensory input, but, beyond that, what's going on? Parapsychologists may not have a very good idea themselves. I guess the takeaway here is that the connection between ESP and consciousness, or the power of consciousness, or altered states of consciousness, kind of betrays some of the fundamental theoretical assumptions about the way consciousness works and the way ESP is thought to work. Assumptions that parapsychologists have, right? About how consciousness actually works. And maybe it betrays some of their non-materialist, dualist assumptions as well. And that's problematic because science works on naturalism, and science works. We don't question the scientific results of, stuff that works in our everyday lives, like cars and cell phones and computers. But if a scientific study doesn't show evidence for psi and you believe in psi, you might question it. Well, ask yourself, do you do that for, other things like computers and airplanes? Probably not. So, I'm just saying. These assumptions that some, not all, but some parapsychologists have are, of course, very metaphysical, very substance dualistic. Things like substance dualism is the correct metaphysical outlook. The mind is separate from the body and the brain. Consciousness can affect matter, and so on. These are assumptions that we see in a lot of psi research that really aren't warranted. unfortunately, taking into account, the rest of philosophy and science, if you like. Naturalistic philosophy and science, I mean. Anyway, you can read more about the Ganzfeld experiments in figure 21.6 if you're interested. That's on pages 353 and 354 in chapter 21 of Blackmore's book. Anyway, that's all for ESP. Before we wrap up, let's talk about psychokinesis. All right, so as I mentioned earlier in the lecture, psychokinesis is the ability to affect physical objects or processes without the usual sensory motor means. So the extrasensory motor influence of the external world by the person who's doing the psychokinesis, right? That is what psychokinesis is. And research on psychokinesis has examined things like experiments with dice, random number generators, as I mentioned previously, even tables and spoons, levitating tables, bending spoons, and so forth. Again, as you may have predicted, if you're being a good scientist and making accurate predictions, meta-analyses of psychokinesis, like one that examined the effects of consciousness on dice rolls, which was published by Radin and Ferrari in 1991, do not show any significant overall effects. So there doesn't seem to be anything going on there. But most modern day research into psychokinesis actually examines something that researchers call micro-PK. What is micro-PK? Well, it is extrasensory motor influence upon microscopic or quantum mechanical systems. These are systems that tend to be probabilistic rather than deterministic, right? So if you think of like radioactive decay, this is when you have like, an element, maybe some, something radioactive, of course. I'm not a chemist, so again, I'm not the right person to explain this, but some elements are unstable. They're unstable isotopes, and they lose bits. They'll lose electrons and protons and neutrons. They'll decay, right, into something else. And of course, this decay is governed by quantum mechanical laws. And in quantum mechanics, things are weird. They're random. They're probabilistic, not deterministic. So, these are truly random systems. So we'll have somebody try and do some PK on those systems. And we'll look at some specific examples in a moment of this kind of work. So research began on micro-PK in the 70s, and that was thanks to the technology that was available. We were getting computer random number generators and developing technologies like this, which allowed us to do research on micro-PK. So in an experiment typical of this time period, maybe a participant would attempt to will, like, they try to, turn a light on with their mind, or influence the motion of a light that rotates around an oscilloscope. Maybe you've seen these oscilloscopes. They're like old, clunky looking bits of technology with a circular screen, and there's a light that can rotate around the screen. That's an oscilloscope. Now the lights here were controlled by a random process in these experiments. Particles that are emitted from strontium-90 as it decays. So okay, there's a radioactive element. It probably decays into a stable form of strontium or something else. Again, I don't know if there are any chemists or physicists watching. Let me know. Get me up to speed on my radioactive elements, okay? But basically, what you need to know is that radioactive decay is a truly random process in nature. And we would have people try to influence this random process with extrasensory motor means. So, PK. I mean, things start getting real weird when you start talking about quantum mechanics, and we have got to talk about quantum mechanics. So right now, things are probably going to get a little weird. So I've got some supplementary videos that you can check out because, again, I'm not a physicist, but I have to talk a little bit about physics. And, I'm out of my area. It wouldn't be right for me to try and make authoritative claims here. So I've tried to link you to some videos where people who do know what they're talking about are talking about physics. I can talk to you about PK and the mind and all that stuff, but I'm not a physicist, so. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that some theories of psychokinesis specifically what are termed observational theories, are based upon quantum mechanics and the so-called measurement problem. So we need to talk about the measurement problem here. The measurement problem is kind of what I hinted at earlier, right? The measurement problem is that in quantum mechanics, when we measure something, that is when we observe it, we can actually change the behavior of whatever physical process we're looking at. So some of you may have heard of the double slit experiment, right? This is an infamous experiment that illustrates the kinds of mechanisms that observational theories of quantum mechanics posit. And I've put a link to the video down here. I believe it's Al-Khalili. He's an Oxford physicist. Also, the cool thing about Khalili, like I said, you know, you can be a naturalistic scientist and still believe in, you know, like supernatural things. You know, Khalili is a religious fella. He's a practicing Muslim, and he also studies big questions in physics, like the origin of the universe. So, you know, if you're a believer, don't feel like you have to eschew science, and if you're a scientist, don't feel like you have to be an atheist if you don't want to. I mean, I'm a scientist and an atheist, but, you know, you do you, guys. It's all good. And gals, you do you. Anyway, the double slit experiment, basically, you'll see if you watch the video, but basically, you know, we're shooting subatomic particles, here photons, through this kind of like double slit, right? And we get a different pattern than when we shoot the photons through the slits when we're observing them versus when we're not observing them, right? So when we're not observing them, when the experiment is over, we get like a waveform, and then when we observe, basically light stops acting like a wave and starts acting like a particle, and it goes through one of the two slits, but not both. I know this sounds weird, and again, I'm probably not explaining it very well because, you know, not a physicist, but watch the video. Anyway, this is just meant to be an illustration of, you know, again, the kinds of mechanisms that observational theories are actually positing. So here, psi would not be like a force, but a shift in quantum probabilities that's caused by the observation of a conscious agent. And this is the other thing about observational theories is they often emphasize that it's a conscious agent doing the observation. This is, to me, a little bit misleading, and it's often not the case either. I mean, other interpretations just hold that, you know, because of different things like the photoelectric effect, you know, if we're going to observe an electron, we have to like, or observe an electron or a photon, we have to bounce something else off of it, like another subatomic particle, and of course that is going to interfere with the experiment, or not the experiment, but with what happens with the photon going through one slit or the other, or both. So just be aware that observational theories are not the only answer to the measurement problem. But anyway, here, you know, whether the photons going through the double slits make an interference pattern or go through one split or the other, you know, depends not on some kind of force that my mind exerts, but just the act of me as a conscious agent observing the photons as they're shot through this double slit, right? Now, some claim that this was actually confirmed in an experiment that uses pre-recorded targets. This was done by Schmidt in a 1976 paper. Here, radioactively generated random numbers were converted into clicks on the left and right channels of an audio tape. Now, the tapes were played, and the participants had to influence the clicks to one channel or another. And the idea here is that the clicks are on the tape, but they haven't been listened to or observed yet. So they're not on the left channel or the right channel yet. That's the idea here. And if you want another analogy, think of Schrodinger's cat, you know, the thought experiment, Schrodinger's cat, which again, not a physicist. Go check out the video that I posted in the channel, but Schrodinger's cat is a thought experiment designed to illustrate this weirdness about quantum mechanics. Basically, you have a cat in a box, and there's some poison and a bit of radioactive decay going on, when the stuff decays, it's a random process. And so say there's a 50-50 chance that when you open the box, the element will have decayed and released the poison and killed the cat, or not have decayed. But Schrodinger says the weird thing about quantum mechanics is that, at least on a subatomic level, not at a macro level with real actual cats, but on a subatomic level with subatomic particles, it's like the cat is both dead or alive until you open it and observe it. And then it collapses the wave function or whatever, and it's either dead or alive. This is kind of like Schrodinger's cat, but with clicks on the left and right channel of an audio tape. So again, I apologize that I'm not able to explain these in very much detail. I just don't want to steer you wrong. It is easy to go wrong when it comes to quantum mechanics, and of course I'm not a physicist, so yeah. So anyway, the tapes here in this experiment by Schmidt were stored for a time before they were listened to. So they haven't been listened to by anybody. And then they're stored, they're taken out of storage, they're played, and then an excess of clicks on the channel that the clicks were willed to by the experimental participants was found. In some experiments, the participants were even given the same targets more than once, and in these cases there was a retro PK effect that seemed to be stronger than before. I'm not really sure what that means, but anyway, let's move on. Quantum mechanics, it's too weird, man. Alright, so parapsychologist Dick Bierman has used this method to test something called the subjective reduction interpretation of the measurement problem. And this is along the lines of what I was just discussing vis the double slit experiment, right? The basic idea here in the subjective reduction interpretation is that consciousness, or conscious observation, the observation of a phenomena by a conscious agent, collapses the wave function. What are wave functions? Well, on some interpretations of quantum mechanics, you have this idea of wave functions, and wave functions are like, I guess the best way I could put this, are like possibilities that haven't become actualities. And they don't become an actual state of affairs until they're measured or observed by a conscious agent. So think back to the double slit experiment. When the photons are not observed, when they're being shot through these slits, they form an interference pattern as if it's a wave, if it's lights or the light is traveling in waves. But when it's observed, it forms these two things. It collapses the wave function, and the photon either goes through one slit or the other, but not both, right? That's what this means, essentially. But again, not a physicist. So he recorded, Bierman that is, recorded these auditory invoked potentials from participants while they listened to clicks from previously, unobserved or unlistened to decay events that had been recorded on these tapes, just like in the previous experiment we talked about. And he compared these responses to previously observed decay events, already collapsed into a singular state. Now, his early studies showed a significant difference in brain responses, that is electrical potentials that he measured using EEG, and between the observed and unobserved tapes. So this would seem to suggest that when we're observing, like listening to the tape and collapsing the wave function, there is some interesting electrical activity going on in certain groups of neurons, perhaps, and there are interesting differences between the observed and unobserved tapes. However, again, this is the problem that keeps rearing its head for parapsychology. Others have failed to replicate these results. Like, for example, in another study that Bierman did with Whitmarsh in 2006, they could not replicate these results. So that's a bit of a problem. Another interesting bit of research on psychokinesis comes from the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, or the PAIR Lab. And here, Robert John, I think I'm saying John or Jan, I'm not sure how to pronounce that name. Sorry, Robert, if you're watching. He and his colleagues collected huge volumes of data using these quantum mechanical random number generators. So the idea was to collect all this data. It was all automatically recorded. The direction of the aim of the particles, left, right, whatever, was counterbalanced. Baseline conditions were used as a control, and other researchers have used these same methods since. Then we use a meta-analysis to see if there's any effect for, quantum PK or micro PK in data. And the first major meta-analysis used nearly 600 random number generator PK studies. So that is a massive amount of data. And found chance results on control conditions, but deviations from chance in experimental conditions. The deviations were also statistically significant. Now the effect was small, but it was consistent throughout the entire database. So it didn't seem to be caused by methodological flaws or experimenter error or bias, since it was all done with computers. No experimenters had been involved. And the authors of this analysis interpreted these results as, quote, or evidence of, quote, consciousness-related anomalies in random physical systems. They further concluded, following further meta-analyses, that consciousness can affect the material world. But a subsequent meta-analysis, written by different authors, shows a smaller effect size and that differences between the experimental and control conditions could be reduced to a chance level by including, just a few more non-significant studies. So, yeah, is there really something going on? Maybe, maybe not. There isn't really any more evidence that something is going on than there is, than there is evidence that there is not something going on here. And again, a common theme in all of this is consciousness, right? Parapsychologists who find this kind of evidence convincing for PK often, as with ESP, make the claim that consciousness is somehow involved. And that's because certain of these parapsychologists are arguably dualists, and that metaphysical outlook affects how they understand these experimental results. They might believe that the mind or consciousness is non-physical, but can still act as a force within the physical universe. Now, if you watched my videos on Descartes that I linked earlier, you'll be familiar with the mind-body problem. You'll also be familiar with it if you've taken like any philosophy of mind class or history of modern philosophy class as well. The mind-body interaction problem is a problem that Descartes actually introduces with dualism. If the brain and body are physical substance and the mind is non-physical, non-extended thinking substance, well, how do they interact? How does the mind control the body? And how does, stuff like sense data and whatnot from the environment go to the body and into the mind? How does that all work? It's kind of a problem that Descartes introduced and never really solved. I think this kind of dualist view when it comes to the power of consciousness and the ability to affect the external world with the power of consciousness actually introduces a similar problem, a sort of, mind-world interaction problem, if you like. If consciousness is non-physical, how can it affect the physical world in like a PK or ESP sort of way? It doesn't really make any sense. It's something that parapsychologists would really have to explain, and they'd have to do some, pretty impressive metaphysical backflips to make this make sense, I guess. Others, of course, appeal to quantum mechanics, claiming that consciousness, is a result of quantum mechanical processes, and that's why it can affect quantum mechanical processes. And there are quantum theories of consciousness. They're talked about in, bad documentaries, like the aforementioned What the Bleep Do We Know? Radin, in a 2006 publication, uses the idea of quantum entanglement, the idea that two subatomic particles could be quantum entangled. So whatever happens to one happens to the other, even if they're on, like, opposite ends of the universe or something, right? So he hypothesizes that maybe conscious awareness could be related to entangled particles, and perhaps entangled minds could explain ESP or PK. But there's actually quite little out there in the experimental literature to explain the connection between consciousness and quantum physics, if such a connection even exists. And a lot of people, myself included, think this is just like trading mysteries, right? I mean, there are like dozens of different interpretations of quantum mechanics, some of which do not involve, conscious observers at all. We don't know which ones are correct. They all work reasonably well. We just don't know which ones are actually true. We know which ones work, but beyond that, it's still kind of weird and mysterious down there at the quantum level. And some people do say that maybe consciousness is a product of some kind of, quantum mechanical process that happens in the brain. But, why explain consciousness with quantum mechanics? We don't understand how consciousness works, but we don't fully understand how quantum mechanics works either. So we can't really explain consciousness, which we don't understand fully, with something else that we don't understand fully. That's a problem. We're not going to get any explaining done if we do it that way. So I think this is, a bad idea. It's like swapping one mystery for another. So it's probably not the approach we want to take. How else could we explain belief in these kinds of phenomena? If Blackmore is right and these experimental results really aren't sufficient to conclude that ESP and PK exist, well, why do people believe in these phenomena? Well, there's a couple things, a couple possibilities that we could consider here. And one is an interesting notion that actually comes from Sigmund Freud. Now, the last time I taught this class, we looked at the uncanny right off the bat. This time, we're going to look at it a bit later, but I thought it would be a good idea to still introduce this idea now, because it's quite an interesting one, and perhaps could explain why people believe in these things. So what is the omnipotence of thought? Let's talk about that. So in his essay, The Uncanny, Sigmund Freud, who is a psychoanalyst, talked about this idea of the omnipotence of thought, and it is a sort of animistic tendency for people to attribute strange coincidences or other uncanny events to the power of thought and the ability of thought to actually affect reality. So it's an animistic tendency in the sense that Freud thought it's kind of, it's funny the way Freud talks about it. We wouldn't really talk about this in these terms in contemporary psychology circles, but Freud looks at primitive man, like early humans, as animistic, and indeed when we were hunter-gatherers we arguably were very animistic, and that animism is the tendency to see the world as alive and populated by gods and spirits and so forth. So trees, rocks, rivers, everything kind of has a spirit, and the world is this living place. Maybe our thoughts can affect the world the same way, and this is this old animistic tendency to think of our thoughts as having the power to affect the world. That's the omnipotence of thought, and it's quite closely related to this notion of the power of consciousness that I've been discussing today. Susan Blackmore doesn't discuss this in this chapter, but it's an interesting idea, and maybe people who believe in the paranormal would also have a greater tendency to this sort of animistic omnipotence of thought outlook. I'm not aware of any research that's actually been done on this exact question, but it would be interesting to see if there is anything out there, or if there isn't, to do an experiment and see if people who believe in the paranormal are also more inclined to think that their thoughts influence reality. So that's something cool to look into. Maybe the omnipotence of thought and strange coincidence can explain why people believe in psi and things like ESP and PK, right? Maybe some people, for one reason or another, just judge coincidences as more unlikely to occur than they are. And coincidence is something that Blackmore actually does talk about, by the way. You can see her example of the dream of the car crash victim that she starts and ends the chapter with. So just pay close attention to that if you want to know what we're getting at here. So people might judge coincidences as more unlikely to occur than they are, but they may not realize that the coincidence is far more likely to occur than they thought. So it's really not all that weird that maybe some strange coincidence happens. Maybe it's not all that strange, right? And we don't need to invoke psi phenomena to explain this weird coincidence. And some research shows that people who are better at making probability judgments, judgments about the probability of something having happened, are actually less likely to report psychic experiences and less likely to believe in the paranormal. So that's interesting. That's along the lines I mentioned, along the lines I was talking about just a few moments ago. People who are better at making probability judgments are less likely to think that something psychic has happened to them, right? Or less likely to believe in the paranormal. That's pretty interesting. And people who believe in the paranormal are more likely to report things like seeing an image in an ambiguous figure, or meaningful signals in meaningless noise, and stuff like that. So, earlier I mentioned the show Ghost Hunters, and they would maybe go into a haunted house, set up a microphone for the night, and record all the sounds, all the ambient noise, and then they listen to it the next day, and maybe they think they hear something like, get out, or something creepy. Of course, this is just noise. It is the experimenters who are putting this, get out, or whatever they're hearing. They are hearing things, and they're more likely to hear these things if they already believe in the paranormal and are bad at making probability judgments. So this is a sort of cognitive, maybe not a bias, but a sort of cognitive, tendency that some people have, where things kind of go haywire and we hear things or see things that aren't there. And just keep in mind, I'm not trying to rip on people who believe in the paranormal. Even skeptics like myself have very powerful cognitive biases that are at play, skeptics and believers alike. And a noteworthy example is something called confirmation bias, which you may have heard of. So confirmation bias is a bias toward information that supports one's prior beliefs and values. And sometimes this is characterized by skeptical researchers as, when it comes to, psychical research or psychical experiences, remembering the hits and forgetting the misses. So I've just made up a little example here. Sally believes in ghosts. She is an avid reader of New Age books. She regularly holds seances with her friends. And one night after a seance, she hears a rapping in her attic, like a knocking sound, right? So she appeals to a paranormal explanation. Namely, a spirit has attempted to communicate with her. This explanation fits with her prior beliefs, and her prior values, even though there is a much more parsimonious explanation for the noises she heard. In other words, a physical rather than a non-physical or supernatural cause. But she goes to the supernatural cause first because that supports her beliefs and values, and it's consistent with her worldview, even though it's questionable how well that worldview actually explains what's going on in the world, right? A similar case, you could look at somebody who goes to visit a psychic, and a psychic might use cold reading and actually get a lot of details wrong in the reading, but people will forget this and remember the hits. They'll also misremember other things. They might misremember the psychic as having provided some detail that the person getting the reading didn't provide, when in fact, if you record the whole thing and go back, the person getting the reading actually did provide that information, and the psychic just kind of sneakily forgot about it and came back to it in an impressive kind of way, using cold reading techniques, right? So that's another example of remembering the hits and forgetting the misses. And scientists, of course, are also subject to these biases among, confirmation bias and other kinds of biases, all kinds of biases. And this is why they design experiments with rigorous controls, different experimental conditions, using the best statistical analyses and the best experimental designs, peer reviewing each other's work, trying to replicate each other's studies. That's why scientists do this. So, if it looks like your methodology is questionable or we can't replicate the results, then, is there anything really going on? We have cause to question whether there really is, if we, can't replicate results, or if we get non-significant results, or results that appear significant but which turn out not to be with subsequent analysis. So, there you go. So let's wrap things up. Now, of course, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, Blackmore is a former parapsychologist, but after many years of parapsychological research, she decided that there was not enough evidence for her to continue with this research, and now she's a skeptic writer and talks about writes books on consciousness and interesting psychological things like that, but she no longer believes in the paranormal, and she doesn't do paranormal research. And she concludes at the end of this chapter that paranormal phenomena, as you may have guessed, probably don't exist. Because after decades of research, there just isn't any strong evidence for ESP or PK, as we've seen in this survey today. And even if they do exist, they're probably very weak, and they're probably not effects of consciousness. They're probably not abilities that we could even consciously control. So either they don't exist, or they do exist, but, we can't really do anything with them. They're kind of like maybe automatic, weak, non-conscious, very, very different from the kinds of phenomena that a spiritualist or a parapsychologist is really interested in studying, right? Now, one thing that I want to say here, and that Blackmore also says, if we reject the paranormal, does that mean we also have to reject spiritual experiences? A lot of folks are religious or spiritual, and they don't want to throw that spiritual baby out with the paranormal bathwater, as it were. And Blackmore actually doesn't think we need to do that. We don't need to reject spiritual experiences. Indeed, Blackmore herself meditates, smokes weed, probably goes on an occasional mushroom trip here and there. She's interested in having spiritual, altered states of conscious type experiences, So she thinks that those experiences are still valuable, but she explores these questions in other chapters of the book that we're not going to look at, unless maybe you want to look at this for a special topic. So, keep it in mind if you'd like to talk about spiritual experiences for one of our special topics. And it's really true, as Blackmore points out, that a lot of spiritual or religious traditions claim that supernatural things exist, miracles, things like that, but that paranormal things either do not exist, or that they do exist but they should be avoided. Like maybe what a paranormal researcher would call paranormal, a religious person might associate with the occult, and they'll want to stay away from that. Or maybe ESP and Psi just doesn't accord with the dogma of your particular religion. So according to maybe Christianity, Islam, Judaism, whatever religion, according to that religion, maybe ESP or PK just do not exist. And maybe sometimes miracles happen, but ESP and Psi phenomena, as I've described them here, just do not exist. So, that's another thing. And as Blackmore kind of cleverly points out, what the heck is so spiritual about bending spoons with your mind or something like that? I mean, really, come on. If you have supernatural powers, are you going to use them to bend spoons, or are you going to save the world? So what can we say for certain here? Well, the power of consciousness, air quotes, seems to be what parapsychologists want to study. But we've seen that this implies a non-materialist understanding of the mind, namely substance dualism. And we run into problems that we can't solve, like the mind-body interaction problem, or the, psi-mind world interaction problem, if you like. It raises more problems than it solves, basically. So we kind of want to stay away from this substance dualism when we do science about the mind and about possible mental abilities like psi. And this is why, for the reasons I've discussed in today's lecture and previous lectures, this is why that psychology is kind of regarded by many today as a pseudoscience. They gave it an honest try. They really did. J.B. and Louisa Rhine started parapsychology at Duke University in good faith to try and make a proper science out of psychical research. And you know what? We've been doing this research ever since, and the research has not revealed results that are as convincing or as rigorous as we need them to be. They just don't meet the scientific standards that we need to conclude that psi phenomena exist. And this is why parapsychology is, kind of pseudoscientific. All right, next time we're going to talk about ghosts. Specifically, we're going to talk about talking to ghosts, communication with the dead. Now remember, Parapsychology, as I've mentioned many times throughout this lecture, tried to distance itself from the spiritual movement of the 19th century. So it didn't examine special individuals like psychical researchers did, and eschewed questions concerning life after death. But the spiritualist movement did not do this. The spiritualist movement was very interested in special individuals, like people who claimed to be mediums and psychics. And spiritualists were very interested in the possibility of life after death. So next time, what we're going to do is look at a few more bits from chapter 21, as well as a few bits from chapter 9 in Blackmore, mostly the last two sections. You can read the entire chapter if you want, but it's only really necessary to read the last two sections, I believe. So yeah, we'll look at a few bits from 21 that we didn't cover today, and those bits that I mentioned from chapter 9. So, yeah, what else? Actually, I suppose that's it for today. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're working hard on your critical responses, which are due soon. By the way, I've been getting a lot of questions about how to cite things. Remember, go to Purdue University's online writing lab, or Purdue's OWL. If you Google that, you'll find a collection of citation style guides for anything you could want. Harvard, MLA, APA, Chicago, all kinds of citation styles. There's no need to ask me about how to cite particular things. You can find this information on Purdue University's online writing lab. Otherwise, that's it for today. So I'll see you guys next time, where we'll talk about ghosts, specifically talking to the dead. All right, bye for now, everyone.